Your window to Africa today. This is Africa in Perspective.
You're welcome back into the conversation. This morning, we speak on Africa in Perspective with Dr. Jimoh Muftau Oluwasegun, a lecturer in African history at the Federal University in Benin, Kebbi. Dr. Oluwasegun, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
To jump right into it, the African continent has seen quite a number of conflicts, not just in the 1960s when independence was granted to most African nations, but more recently we have seen conflicts that have either been started by civilian governments within African nations or by military elements within the nations that have sought to take power for themselves. More recently, we've seen Guinea see the postponement of a return to democracy, and it is one of the worrying trends that have taken over African nations. The question of whether Africa has to be concerned about the complete takeover of the continent's ruling bodies by military authorities has come to the fore again. Is there a source of concern for the African Union?
Good morning, listeners. Since the return of democracy, and what Kayode Fayemi described in one of his works as the fourth democratization of African continent, we thought with the return of democracy, Africa finally come to embrace liberal democracy. But the development on the continent have raised a fundamental question as the suitability of liberal democracy in the face of abject poverty. There is a nexus between material development on the continent, corruption, good governance, rule of law, and, of course, the unprecedented wave of military takeover. You take from Niger to Mali, what are the factors? The pull and push factors for this return of military is bad governance, corruption. Because you cannot have a popular and working democracy. The military always have this at the back of their mind, that they can only strike when there is a general discontent within the populace. You take Niger, for instance, the poverty level in Niger is almost 80%. In Mali, the same thing. These are the recipe for disaster. So it is about bad governance. It's about rising increase in poverty rates on the continent that attracted the military back into governance. So what we should be looking at is the suitability of liberal democracy to Africa. It is the rising cost of living, bad governance, corruption on the continent. So we must sit down as a people and look at what type of government do we want to practice. I am not saying liberal democracy is not good, but you can't have liberal democracy that encourages corruption on the continent, where somebody will loot the treasury, move to Paris, London, or United, and people are wallowing in poverty. The military are part of the general society. They are bound to react. That is just my take.
We've also seen comments from former Nigerian head of state and one of the founding fathers of the Economic Community of West African States, retired General Yakubu Gowon. He's been speaking recently and telling ECOWAS to lift the sanctions that were imposed on Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger Republic. And as we know, these three countries have their governments decided. Their government is headed by military juntas. Now, if the sanctions are lifted, is it in any way going to come across as, if you want, an approval of these military juntas by ECOWAS?
Well, the sanctions in the first place are externally induced. To me, the sanction should not be the first thing that ECOWAS should have taken. Because the man in Niger was brought up by the French, and the French were busy making the resources of Niger. So, from all indications, the military takeover in Niger was welcomed by the people. ECOWAS, you cannot cry more than the bereaved. ECOWAS is just a club, to use the word of Julius Malema. ECOWAS is a flop. Do they call themselves to order? Is there any peer review mechanism in? You look at Niger, the man there, propped up by the French, poverty rate on the high side, same thing with Mali, same thing with Burkina Faso. For me, the sanctions should be lifted in the interest of the people. The people who of course, they are suffering collateral damage. But there are ways you can deter military coup on the continent without necessarily being, this harsh economic sanctions. Because the nations sanctioned on are bound to look for new allies. They are bound to take new initiative. If the care is not taken, ECOWAS will be balkanized, ECOWAS will be divided, and that might mark the beginning, the beginning of an end of ECOWAS. When you notice bad governance in certain countries, what did you do to address the situation? When you notice corruption, monumental corruption like we have in Nigeria in the last 15 or 10 years, what ECOWAS, what are the measures put in place? Not just ECOWAS, international community as well, because money laundering, corruption, and whatever, it's still within these international financial institutions. So when people react, you call it military takeover, they should be sanctioned. So civilians should be left to be looting their countries while people are suffering. I think ECOWAS have a kind of a rethink, engage the juntas, think for way forward, establish contact with them, and probably see how you can help them to democratize.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. Dr. Jimoh Mufutau Oluwasegun is a lecturer in African history at the Federal University in Benin, KB, and he joined us to speak on ECOWAS, the rise of military juntas on the continent of Africa, and indeed what can be done to prevent the recurrence of military juntas taking over countries in Africa. You're still listening to Africa in Perspective. Up next, we have amazing facts, this time about Guinea. Do stay with us.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM.